relationship. And I've always thought that the figures simply don't bear that out in any respect. For example, the biggest rows we've had with China during the last 20, 25 years were over the meetings between the Prime Minister and the Dalai Lama, after which miraculously our trade figures, our export figures to China, strangely enough, went up. When I was governor of Hong Kong, having a fairly rocky time in terms of dialogue with China, our exports to China from Britain increased by more than any other OECD country. It wasn't because of me, it was because I think the Chinese buy what they want at the best price they can get for it. And if they can get a better price by people thinking they have to give China favors, then they'll go on feeding that sentiment. But it's a combination, I think, of people still giving China or the Chinese Communist Party the sort of mandate of heaven when it comes to doing international business with them. And I've always thought, I mean, the document which the government produced, which I'm sure we'll have a chance of talking about in a moment, talks, I think, about cooperating, competing and challenging, which is a pretty hopeless, I think, trilogy. But I've thought that it was probably, if you're talking about what policy we should have on China, I think it was less effective than the one you're told about on the tube all the time, when in case there's a parcel which you don't know, see it, say it, sort it. And that seems to be a rather better way of describing where our policy has been on China. But it does go all over the place.
I'll ask you, Lord Patton, which country would you single out as doing it better?
Dealing with China? I think the Germans have done pretty well. It's very difficult now to compare us with any European countries, because we don't anymore have this strength of the European partnership behind us. But I think the Canadians have, just as they've done with Trump, with the President of the United States, I think they've also done pretty well with China. I think if one was being cynical, the country which would say it had done best in its relations with China would be Russia. They've got China helping to arm it in the war in Ukraine, and the Chinese buy huge amounts of oil and other minerals from Russia at prices which are probably fair on both sides. But nevertheless, I think the Russians have managed that relationship, despite the history of their relationship down the years, with tremendous anxieties about the border in Siberia.
Okay. Nigel Inkster.
Yes, thank you. I would agree with quite a lot of what has just been said, though I must confess I'm less confident about a diagnosis of peak China. I'll go into that in a second. I think in terms of UK's relationship with China, we've probably not been very good at going back to first principles and looking in a clear-eyed way at the nature of the Chinese state. And the nature of that state has come into starker relief over the last 8 to 10 years, I think, in terms of it being apparent that for China, its survival and prosperity in its current form is dependent upon eroding the influence of the West. It has become an article of faith amongst the Chinese leadership to say the East is rising, the West is in decline, and they have to believe that. The party's decided that this is what it is, so there is to be no further argument on the subject. China is looking to erode US leadership in the West. It doesn't want to necessarily replace the United States as a global policeman, but it wants to reduce that influence and create a world which is more favorable towards China's interests. It wants to be accepted, its ideology and form of governance to be accepted as normative globally. For that to happen, our system has got to be shown up as inadequate and essentially failing. And I don't think that people have really internalized that reality. Having said that, I think we're also struggling to come to terms with the fact that China, which has been struggling for the last 150 years to achieve a state of modernization whilst preserving its unique cultural characteristics, has not just modernized, but is now starting to define what modernization looks like in the world we now inhabit. And this is something that's very difficult for us, I think, to come to terms with. We've been a long time, assuming that, we were top dog, as it were, that our system was normative and globally desirable. That's, no longer the case. So all of these factors come into play. I think when it comes to peak China, I do question that. And I worry that a perception of peak China is something that has been shaping US approaches to dealing with China in recent days, particularly in terms of the trade dispute that we have seen edging towards some sort of very unsatisfactory compromise solution. I think it's dangerous to write off China and to underplay the very real strengths that China has developed.
Okay. Just when you look at the kind of multifaceted challenge that the UK faces, and you look at, I think it was Ken McCallum saying that between 2018 and 2022 there was a 7 times increase in the number of espionage cases that MI5 was dealing with, which you may have some insight into, or whether you look at the number of challenges, the hack into the Electoral Commission, or some of the economic challenges we're facing in terms of IP theft and so on. Would you say that China represents an enemy, Nigel?
No, I would not. And I would point out to the committee that at no point in the past did the UK government ever designate the Soviet Union as an enemy. And
what would you describe it as?
Well, as appears in multiple government documents in recent time, it is a challenge. It can pose a threat. But it is also a country which we cannot ignore and with which we do have to engage. I don't think China seeks to represent an existential threat to the UK in the way that the Soviet Union sought to do.
Okay. Thank you. Just briefly, Lord Patton and then Isabel Hilton.
You finish up balancing and missiles on pinheads. I mean, I think that China is a threat across the board, and I don't think you can discount what the heads of MI5, MI6, GCHQ have said publicly, and in one or two cases, I think on the same platform as the FBI. I think what makes China a particular danger is the existential threat which it feels from the things which Hong Kong represented, like free speech, like newspaper, like free media. I think that China which is ultimately a huge weakness. China is incapable, not China, but Chinese Communist Party is incapable of reforming itself, incapable of adapting to the things which actually make it easier to have an innovative and imaginative economy. And I think it's no surprise that the sort of Leninists in charge of the Chinese economy have cracked down so much on bits of the private sector which have actually produced most of the imaginative growth in the last few years. So I think the real weakness of China is that it can't change itself, or the Chinese Communist Party, is that it can't change itself and adapt. And I'm very struck, sorry, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Just conscious of time, because a lot of questions that we want to put to you, but we could, I'm sure, talk for hours. Isabel Hilton.
On the question of enemy, I don't find it a very helpful word in this context, to be honest. I think that the party is concerned with regime security, and that leads it to be an adversarial power in many respects to Western democracies. And I think that simply to call it an enemy doesn't really help in coming up with a strategy.
Thank you. Sarah Champion.
Can I just add one footnote to that? I take the point, but you're certainly not a friend if you lock up British citizens for 5 years and don't allow them any consular access. And in the case of Jimmy Lai, who's a committed Catholic, don't allow him to hold communion in just a sort of piece of vengefulness. You're certainly not a friend if you put a bounty on Chinese who are living here now, mostly Hong Kongers, 180,000 of them. If you put a bounty on their heads for which anybody can collect, who can actually deliver them back to China to be locked up. So those aren't acts of friendship, clearly, but maybe they're certainly not enemies in the sense of being about to drop a bomb on us, but I don't think they're the greatest of friends.
Sarah Champion wants to come out.
Thank you. First of all, can I start by saying, Lord Patton, thank you for all you did as governor, and thank you for all you've done to try and protect Hong Kongers ever since. And I was struck by your see it, say it, sorted comment, because when I've tried to report things, no one wants to take responsibility for it. So who do you think should be sorting this?
Sorry, what was that?
Who should be sorting it when it comes to espionage threats from China to the UK?
Well, I feel very strongly that we should, when we see it, we should say it. And we shouldn't feel awkward about disturbing the Chinese by pointing out what they're up to.
But if you're in government now, and rather than being in the Foreign Office or being in business and trade or wherever, who would you say, which department, which individual should take ownership of this? As Sarah's saying, who should she report it to?
Well, first of all, I don't think it should be the Treasury. The Treasury is not known for its great depth of knowledge about China, and the Treasury, unfortunately, ignores the Chinese wisdom of taking account of what's happening before you try to provide evidence for your next step. I think that it's interesting in relation to two of the last rows about China and its behaviour, that David Lammy has spoken up, I think, very well. But you won't get. There are some departments which are scared stiff, I suspect trade is, of saying anything which sounds as though it's critical of China, because they think completely incorrectly that if they do that, they'll lose export opportunities for our trade. And it's just bilge, and it always has been.
Okay, we must move us on, I'm afraid. Mike Martin.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all of you for taking the time. My questions are for Lord Hutton, if I may. Lord Hutton, Lord Patton, I'm so sorry. How does China view the UK, both at a governmental level, I suppose I should say a Communist Party level, and also across the wider society?
Well, I think it very much depends. when the Chinese took back Hong Kong, as they were entirely entitled to, they started describing China not as Hong Kong, not as a colony or an ex-colony, but as an occupied territory. And what they didn't ever point out, or other people didn't point out, that it was occupied. It was occupied by Chinese, by people who were refugees from the Great Leap Forward, from the Cultural Revolution, who crawled over barbed wire, who swam through difficult waters, who, in the case of Jimmy Lai, stowed away in order to get to, heaven forbid, a British colony, an aspect of British imperialism. And why did they get there? Why did they want to go there? Because the things which Hong Kong represented, and which its best our liberal values represent, was freedom. I'm very struck when I talk to Hong Kong diaspora citizens in Britain. You say to them, it must have been a terrible wrench for you, leaving your job and your home in Hong Kong. It must have been a terrible wrench, leaving your friends. And they reply as though all schooled to say the same thing, but it just means that I think they have the same experience. We wanted to bring up our children in freedom. And that is an extraordinarily powerful part of the reason for the Chinese Communist Party finding it difficult to get on with this. It's because they feel that sentiment very strongly that when they read about the Chinese trying to build the biggest embassy in the world, they start to worry about what that means for surveillance and what it means for intimidation of them and their friends.
But how does the Chinese government view us, view the UK now in 2025? For instance, how did they view the sailing of the UK carrier task group out to, the seas just off China earlier this year?
I would guess that they're nervous whenever it looks as though we're in any sort of way increasing our understanding and commitment to Taiwan and to Taiwan's continuing status. And I think they would think that we were sometimes showing a tendency to be too big for our boots, given that our boots have shriveled over the last few years.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, distinguishing between the Hong Kong Communist, the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese people, I think that there's quite a lot of good feeling about Britain, not least because of association football.
And how much do you think the actions of the UK government bother the actions of the Chinese government? Like, imagine Xi Jinping's in tray. Where are we in terms of, obviously the US is probably the one they're worried about the most, but where would we, do we even feature in the kind of things that he needs to worry about and think about in terms of Chinese foreign policy?
I wouldn't have thought he gives them more than the occasional minute to reflecting on Britain's role in the world or Chinese relationship to Britain. He would not want Britain to sound too enthusiastic about the United States. And he's probably, the Chinese used to be pretty well the only people who believed in the European Union, and that's probably disappeared now. I don't know, but I wouldn't think he's disturbed or thinks very much about Britain, unless it's in relation to probably Taiwan, and it's in relation to something we should be much more conscious about and do more about, and that is face up to China when it breaks its agreements, which it does not. I'm not just thinking about the joint declaration in Hong Kong, but it's very difficult to think of an agreement which China has reached which it hasn't forgotten about conveniently when it doesn't suit them. And that's true about the international health regulations going back to COVID, and it's true about, I'm sure it would be true about the environment as well.
Nigel, Mike, Nigel, did you want to come in on that?
On the whole question of how China views the UK, I mean, I agree that in the overall scheme of things, we occupy a very small proportion of Chinese leadership time. But nonetheless, I mean, they don't want a worse relationship with us than they need to have. I think that much is clear. But to the extent that we do things that hack them off, like hanging out with the Americans, like being part of NATO, like sailing a carrier battle group close to the Taiwan Straits, they are always going to react and react forcibly.
I can add one other thing which hacks them off. Plainly, you can't ignore this morning's newspaper reports about Sheffield Hallam University, and that is a common feature. And our universities are, I think, better than they were in trying to ensure that China's studies can be conducted in a way which doesn't hurt Hong Kong or Chinese students. There are all sorts of things you can do, like anonymizing essays. But I think the Chinese do get nervous about the amount of really good research which is done on things like the Uyghurs and other issues in China in British universities, and we should continue doing it.
Okay. That's really interesting. And then just one final question I've made. Recently, obviously, our China policy has sort of waxed and waned over the years, but we're having a thaw or an unfreezing at the moment. Notwithstanding your comments that perhaps we could be a lot less timid in our forthrightness, how has that unfreezing been viewed in the Chinese government? I mean, is that something that they've driven, or, I mean, do they want it to happen? Are they that fast, or is it quite important to them for the reasons that you cite, that we're a member of NATO and all the rest of it?
Is that a question to me or to Lord Patton?
To Lord Patton initially, but if you want to come in, then feel free.
Well, I'm not sure whether or not the observation of that former Russian dissident Jordevsky would apply to China as well as to Russia. I think he once said that we shouldn't forget that authoritarian regimes are always more comfortable with democracies and open societies if they're obviously not prepared to stand up to the authoritarian regimes. And I think that's probably true of China as it was in the past of Russia.
Isabel Hilton, did you want to come in? I sense you.
Yes, I mean, I think that the problem is for Britain to decide how vigorously it will defend the values that it proclaims. And I agree that I think that the UK has been both confused and on the whole timid. A lot of Chinese reaction is performative and quite loud, but that doesn't make it a major threat. Where it seeks to ensure that Britain stays silent is in this pursuit of global normative power that Nigel mentioned, and that includes a rewriting of global priorities away from individual human rights, for example, towards the predominance of states over political and civil rights. And Sheffield Hallam University and the work that was done there gets in the way of that. And so that's China's reaction. Now it's up to the United Kingdom. Do we fund our universities sufficiently that any sort of economic threat, which appears to be one of the things that the university considered, is moot? And that's our decision.
Yep. We'll come back to that.
Final question, if I may, to you, Ms. Hilton. Do you think that the Treasury and the Trade Department have too much control over British foreign policy with respect to China?
Well, I'm not in government. However, that's
why I asked you the question.
Yes, certainly in the golden era, I think a very, very unwise and apparently Treasury-driven policy cost the British taxpayer far more than than a more realistic and informed policy would have done. It involved us rushing into agreements that we then had to buy our way out of. At considerable expense. And I think that a more informed and perhaps more circumspect policy would in the end have been a much better bet.
Lord Boateng.
Thank you.
Can I just add one point about the Golden Age? Launched, I think, when George Osborne was in Urumqi while Muslims were being locked up. During the Golden Age, British exports to China went down. So whatever else happened, pints of beer and all that, it didn't seem to make very much difference to that sort of utilitarian judgment.
Thank you for that. Lord Boateng.
Mr. Incaster, a question for you. You've served this country over many years in this area, and I was particularly struck by a comment you made. The UK must be shown to have failed. That's something that the Chinese are very keen to do. Both houses represented around this table have produced reports on China and the Arctic, and on China and Africa. And I wonder if there are any comments you'd like to make in that regard, in terms of seeing China as a competitor and a threat, but also it's been said by witnesses to both houses in these reports as a potential cooperator. Have you got any views about that?
Yes, I do. I mean, it's certainly the case that China is expanding its influence into the areas that you mentioned and others as well. And I actually remember a long time ago, shortly after I left government, talking to China's state councillor about all of this, China's expanding global influence. This was at a time when the official Chinese policy was hide and bide. It wasn't one of growing assertiveness. And I remember saying to the State Council, well, this is all very well, but as your engagement grows, so you find yourself being caught up in a dynamic that you can't always control, and you'll probably end up doing things you never set out to do, rather as happened with the United Kingdom. We never set out to govern India. It was only the incompetence of the East India Company that led us to undertake this rather ambitious project. And I think China, I think, is moving towards this phase at the moment, and I think it may, in due course, find itself possibly unpleasantly surprised by some of the consequences of the engagement that it's now pursuing. But I mean, in certain areas, I think we have to acknowledge that China's engagement in, for example, Africa, is seen by the countries concerned as beneficial. It's delivered infrastructure and development projects that would otherwise not have been possible. Not perhaps in the ways that we would approve of, and some of the things that have happened, in particular China's provision of communications systems to these countries, complete with all the surveillance capabilities that are built into the Chinese systems, clearly very unwelcome. But if we take a kind of broad strategic view that it is in our interest for these countries to develop and prosper to the point where they no longer feel a massive imperative to migrate northwards to Europe and the UK, then arguably yes, there would be occasions in which we might want to look for opportunities to cooperate with China. I think that is something that would be worth pursuing. When it comes to the Arctic, I think we're looking at more an issue of raw geo-strategic competition. And managing that, I think, is going to be much more of a challenge and probably fewer opportunities to cooperate. But I think at best what we might be able to do is look at ways in which we can engage in a degree of strategic avoidance, not unnecessarily getting in each other's way, but I'm not sure we can do much more than that.
I'm going to have to move us on. We're going to run out of time otherwise. So I'm going to bring in Liam Byrne now, but if I could just ask our witnesses, really fascinating to hear, but if you could just ensure your answers are a little bit more pithy, that would be much appreciated. Liam Byrne.
Thanks, Chairman. I just want to get into how we demodel some of the trade-offs. So I think ministers would say they're working with China to try and advance some great global goals, tackling climate change, improving development, advancing economic interests and prosperity, and standing up for UK interests and values. I think they would broadly say those are the goals, that's what they're trying to trade off. I think implicit in a lot of what we've heard today is that those trade-offs not being made in the right way. So, Isabel Hilton, let me just ask you, how do you think the government should be striking a better balance between those objectives in the future?
Well, I think it's important for all departments in government to be aware of the potential security risks of anything that we do with China. I've spent many years working on climate change. China has very proactive policy on climate change and now dominates, as you know, the supply of low-carbon goods and technologies to this country. They are the cheapest. There are two problems here. One, because of China's mode of production, it undermines competitor companies, and that happened in telecommunications, it's happened in solar panels, and it will happen in European wind if we don't actually take active measures to protect European wind. That creates dependencies which can then be weaponized, and we've seen this relatively recently. There's a second problem with connected technologies, which all climate technologies are, which they connect to our critical national infrastructure. And if China and Russia are in a limitless friendship, then we have to take that as a security risk. And I have not seen an argument beyond, they're a very good price.
But given those perils, how do you advise ministers to make better decisions about the trade-offs in the future?
I think that they have to be absolutely that security. If you, I don't know what China's intentions would be, but if you give China the capacity to interfere with national security and critical infrastructure, then you have frankly been irresponsible. So that needs to be a priority.
So the implication of that is that we're going into this relationship, we're prosecuting this relationship without the right defences in place.
Well, as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen the technological defence and I haven't seen the strategic alternative.
Let me just roll it back. I mean, we don't have a Uyghur Forced Labour Act in this country, and we have this story in The Guardian this morning about Laura Murphy's research being forced to be dropped. We are considering considerable investment from Mingyang into the offshore wind infrastructure in the way that once upon a time we considered allowing Huawei into the telecoms network. And our diversification strategy is so poor that we appear to be vulnerable to next period China stopping chip exports and threatening to bring production in the automotive industry to a halt. I mean, are we actually able to make the right trade-offs if we haven't got the right defences in place?
Well, all the examples you cite are examples of failing to consider and put in the right defences from the beginning. And if we continue down that path, then we are accepting that we are helpless, which I don't like to think we are. We have allies. We have all the countries our size have a similar problem. We can make alliances over, for example, mitigation of technological risk and indeed supply chain risk. And there is an increasing willingness, I think, in liberal democracies to explore those options. I think we should actively explore them, and we should be prepared to bear the cost.
Should we be allowing companies like Mingyang to invest in offshore wind infrastructure in the UK?
Not if we do not have a technological defence against potential weaponisation.
Lord Patton, what's your view on how we make better trade-offs and defend ourselves more effectively?
I very much agree with what Isabel has just said. And you could not only start thinking about turbines, but also about EVs, about electric vehicles, which, as everybody knows now, I think, are mobile surveillance operations. And I think I'm right in saying that the Prime Minister's car was stripped down to see what it might be reporting for China. But I think overall that it would certainly help if we got to move on and produce this audit, which is supposed to be the basis of our future strategy on China, and which would certainly help not just government, but local government and universities and techno firms to know to coordinate how we deal with China and to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Nigel Inkster, are we
Yeah.
getting the trade-offs right? Are we defended effectively enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my line of business, you always start with the worst-case assumptions and work back from them.
Quite right,
And I think in this situation, dealing with China, that is what we've got to do. What is the worst thing that could happen? What can we do to mitigate this? And then only then do we actually move forward in terms of engagement.
Dame Emily.
I'd like to ask you about the China audit, and which only part of which has been published and the rest is secret. I'd like to ask you about the China strategy, which is completely secret, I think. And I wondered whether you've already referenced the story in the papers about Sheffield Hallam. Do you think it would be, what kind of advice useful advice could you anticipate within a China strategy that might be published, that might be able to help universities defend themselves against aggression and intimidation from China?
Well, first of all, on the audit, I totally agree with what you said some time ago, that it is barking mad to have an audit which is supposed to...
I didn't say barking mad.
No, I'm a vulgar Tory, former Tory. I think it would be crazy for us to think we should publish an audit, but not let most of the people who would benefit from reading it actually see it.
Exactly.
I mean, it's extraordinary to have that audit and then put off for months publishing it. And when you do actually publish it, there's one very short answer to a question in the House of Commons. And attached to the answer is a long explanation as why you can't tell people most of what you'd like to tell them because it's secret. I mean, it is absolutely barking. Sorry, that word again. And you were right to say that, but not that word. But until you've, I think, got people to see things in more or less the same way, it's not going to make much sense to try to produce a strategy. So I think an effective audit is a basis for having a strategy. On universities, inevitably, because universities, higher education has been underfunded by governments for some time, they've started to depend perhaps too much on recruiting foreign students, and they've then put themselves in a position where they can be bullied and pushed. I mean, one of our best China scholars, in effect, left his job as a professor at one university because they tried to stop him speaking about China when there was a visit by a distinguished Chinese Politburo member. So he went off to another university. And that sort of thing is
that openly known? Are you
Sorry?
able to? Is that known? Are you able to tell us the names of the universities, or is it not known?
I'm not sure, but I can...
Okay.
But Isabel, you were nodding.
Yes.
I think it was Nottingham, wasn't it?
Yes.
He's an extremely good historian of China.
Right.
I think universities have some experience of trying to ensure that Chinese and Hong Kong students at universities have the same experience of a liberal education, of an open society education, as other students. Not all do it as effectively as they should. And it's of course worth noting that as well as bad Chinese practices in universities, a lot of our universities benefit hugely from substantial donations from rich Chinese, which have been without any strings, really. I mean, the university I know best has certainly been in that category. Others take money and then get bullied. And we should be open in saying that. And I think the Office of Students has actually been pretty clear about wanting to stand up for freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry at universities. If we don't have those in a free society, heaven help us.
Baroness, we have to move on now.
Can I ask one other?
Is it brief?
Yeah.
A brief question.
Okay. You've talked about the Germany doing well in terms of Germany's strategy in relation to China. And certainly one of the things the government said was that they were trying to line up with the G7 allies. It's right, isn't it, that Germany has published its China audit?
Yeah, it is.
Do you know why it can be published in Germany and not in Britain? No.
No, I ever see the German ambassador, I'll ask him.
And do let us know. Baroness Fall.
Thank you very much, Chair. Lord Patton, just to stick with the university point, the years that you were Chancellor of Oxford, to my knowledge, Oxford doesn't have a Confucius Centre. Is that correct?
Confucius Institute.
Confucius Institute.
Not a Computers Institute.
Was that something that you decided not to host when you were Chancellor?
No, it wasn't. I mean, I have to say that decisions like that, I was very happy, and questions about research collaboration, I was very happy to leave to academics on the whole. They got absolutely spot on, including refusing a huge research collaboration project with Huawei.
But so you didn't make a decision about not having the institute because you were worried about sort of censorship of what they.
I can't remember any details of that, but I certainly wouldn't have made that sort of decision. I was too conscious of my position as one in which, to borrow from Roy Jenkins, impotence was assuaged by magnificence.
Very good, thank you. Turning to, we just talked about, and my colleague Liam Byrne just talked about the balance between sort of national security, human rights, sovereignty and economic prosperity, if you like, and whether we were getting that balance wrong, which clearly most of the panel think we are. And you mentioned Germany as an example of where you thought they were sort of getting it better. Why?
I really couldn't answer that question intelligently, so I'll try to answer it. I just think that they have. It's clear that some of the main bridges between Germany and China are individual companies which have huge businesses there, and I think that may have helped a bit. Can I just add one other point? That somebody mentioned earlier China's activities in Africa, which are obviously in part a consequence of the fact that the USA program was cut to ribbons by the richest man in the world. And I don't think one should underestimate the extent to which these days, for the Chinese, President Trump is the gift that goes on giving.
Do you think that our new inward investment law is tough enough? You talked about scrutinising inward investment. Do you think we need to be tighter? It's relatively new. Do you think it's working well?
I think it seems to be, and as you know, the Chinese are in the section which is subject to most detailed scrutiny.
One last question, if I may. When we signed the FTA recently with the Americans, they added a clause about scrutiny in supply chains. Do you think the Americans are unduly influential in dictating our own China policy?
I would doubt in influencing our China policy. The Americans have made a fuss recently about the size of the new Chinese embassy or proposed embassy, but I can't think of many other things. I think they've got. I think they would be uncomfortable about some of the things we say about human rights, lest they come home to bite other people.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Thank you, Patton. Any views from the panel on these?
If I could just add on that point, there is one example, and of course that is the whole Huawei saga, 5G, where the Americans made it abundantly clear that there would be serious consequences if we went ahead with that particular project and effectively threatened to withhold intelligence cooperation, which is not a trivial consideration. So, I mean, I think that is something that the UK is going to have to think about quite carefully. I think at the moment, the somewhat mercurial and quixotic nature of US policy making makes it rather difficult for us to anticipate such developments, but we can't discount them.
I dissent slightly from Lord Patton's view of the success of the German relationship with China. I think that it's pretty problematic. But if you're looking for a case study, I would look to Japan. It's much the same size as we are. It's very close. It has a problematic history. It's an ally of the United States, and it's handled it rather well, I think.
That's true.
Ernest Tyler, do you want to come in?
Yes, just very briefly, and very much actually following on from what Isabel's just said, and thinking about how we could strengthen collaboration with some of our international partners and allies. I know a recent Chatham House paper argued that the UK needed to align more closely, I think, with what it called the Indo-Pacific Four, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea. And I just wondered how you thought the UK government should go about that, particularly in terms of, sort of trying to avoid undercutting each other's approaches to China and coordinating on things like development support for the region. Is there a sort of a template for how we could actually manage that process?
Well, I think we're talking quite sort of multifaceted relationships, but in terms of strategic interests, I think those four are pretty much aligned. They all recognise they have to deal with China. Some of them are much closer than we are, but they're all trying to de-risk and hedge against future problems, as China is. China has been de-risking and hedging for at least 10 years now in anticipation of a stronger confrontation with Western liberal democracies. And I think we should learn from that example. For example, in the choke points that we will suffer from, like everybody else, over strategic minerals and rare earth magnets and so on, there are increasing moves to source and develop refining capacity elsewhere, including in President Trump's swing through Asia this last week, much discussed. All countries our size and with our level of development have the same issue. We need to get together. China is very good at divide and rule. The same is true for British universities. The British universities could establish a convention that they would all sign up to resist pressure. It would give them collective strength. As it is, China picks off individual entities, one by one. Does the same with international relations. So the more alliances we can build, the better we will be.
Thank you very much. Any other thoughts on this point?
Can I just add one point? I mean, I share Isabel's enthusiasm about Japan and the role it plays as a country which has its own sense of identity but still an international player. I have a real regret that we haven't been better, not least at the university I know best, at recruiting more Japanese students. Surprisingly, though the Japanese are very outward looking, they don't send students abroad as much as the Chinese do, but that's partly, I guess, the result of the quality of their own universities. I would love it if there were more Japanese students here.
Mr. Instant, anything you'd like to add?
And simply picking up Isabel's point very briefly, the extent to which China expresses a vocal objection to alliance relationships, I think, is a testimony to the utility of these relationships.
Thank you very much.
Eric Twig.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Instead, I'll just refer back to your opening comments at the beginning of the proceedings about the threat that the Chinese pose. And in the context of our abilities to be able to prosecute those who might be suspected of assisting the Chinese state or the Chinese Communist Party, do you think if the government was clearer about the precise nature of the threats that was being posed, that we would be in a better position to prosecute those suspected of assisting the Chinese state and Communist Party, and particularly given the recent case around the Chinese spies?
Well, that case that you just referred to is, of course, an issue that arises from old and, frankly, not fit-for-purpose legislation. It has now been replaced by legislation, the National Security Act, which I think would make it much easier for such prosecutions to be to take place. Because the mere fact of working for a foreign state and failing to disclose that fact is ipso facto an offence that can be prosecuted. So I think the new legislation should make a difference, but of course everything legislation is one thing, implementing it effectively is another.
Sorry, but I assume you read the statements produced by the Deputy National Security Advisor, yeah, which was used obviously to aid the government's prosecution. Having read them, do you think there wasn't sufficient grounds to continue with that prosecution?
No, I think that the prosecution should have gone ahead, and the jury entrusted to use their good sense to deliver a verdict. I think
regardless of the change
Yes.
in legislation, regardless of the fact that the government's not been specifically clear about the nature of the threat, in your view, we still should have gone ahead.
In the case of the Bulgarian.
Exactly. Yeah, there is a precedent here. So,
okay.
yes.
Given your long experience in this background,
But going to your the earlier point of your question, how do we actually increase awareness of the problem of the threat without gratuitously causing offence and giving China reasons to react adversely? This is a more difficult problem. There is an issue of public education here, and I think the utility of having such prosecutions is not because it will deter China. It won't. But what it does do is raise public awareness of the problems that need to be dealt with.
And so, based on what you've said, I suspect that maybe the answer may be no to this, but it'll be interesting to see what your view is that given the change in legislation, given what we know today, is there any other sort of challenges the security services and the police face in bringing such supporting such prosecutions?
Not that I'm aware of. I think they have the basic tools, and I think one of the issues we do have collectively is that there is still a relative lack of expertise in our security agencies with relation to China, and we need to remedy that. But it's not just there. I think across government there is a lack of expertise in China. The Chinese language is not seen within government as something that is conducive to rapid preference and promotion through the system, and I think this needs to change. And efforts are being made, but more work is needed.
Lord Robertson.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm under pressure to be quite swift. So this question goes to you, Mr. Inkster, although others may wish to add. Lord Patton's already mentioned the Chinese embassy, and we know that the plans to have a very large embassy on the Royal Mint Street site, and the fact that the government has called it in and is going to make a decision next month. Mr. Inkster, do you think the new embassy should be given the go-ahead? Could you say what security issues you... Going back to what was talked about before, what consequences have if the embassy is built, given the security concerns and indeed the proximity to the City of London?
Yeah. Okay. Well, as to the size of the embassy, I think you need to clarify the fact that this is largely a function of the fact that China, unlike the British Foreign Office, does not employ locally engaged staff. All the staff in the Chinese embassy, up to and including cooks and bottle washers, are from China, and China wants to accommodate them all within one location. So I think that goes a long way to explain why the embassy is going to be the size that it is. In terms of security threat, I think some of the claims that have been made are misplaced and overdone. China does not typically run sensitive intelligence operations out of legal residencies. So I do not accept the proposition that a large Chinese embassy will become a nest of spies in a way that it hasn't done before. Yes, the Chinese will engage in close access signals intelligence collection from the embassy. That is just a fact of life. We all do it. This is just something you have to, accept as unavoidable, and you can't really prevent it. You can only, seek to mitigate the risks where you find it. As to the proximity of cables under the location containing commercially sensitive information, I don't actually know what the risk is. I mean, obviously it is practicable to tap into these fiber optic cables. I know, this can be done. But whether China would be willing to take that risk, given our awareness of the threat and desire to mitigate it, I don't know. And I imagine that also in the worst case we could always move the cables so that they weren't readily accessible. So I mean, I don't think some of these issues are as concerning as they have been made out to be in the popular press.
But we're entitled to raise these points because it's within the last couple of years, isn't it, that you had those terrible scenes at the Manchester consulate with somebody protesting outside about Xi Jinping, I think, being hauled into the consulate to be beaten up, and as a result of which I think 6 Chinese diplomats were sent home. I can understand why the Hong Kong diaspora should be nervous about an embassy that size and should raise questions about whether it would enhance surveillance, whether it would increase intimidation of exiled Chinese or Hong Kong citizens who are here, well, ex-Hong Kong citizens who are living here. They're legitimate worries, I think, and we can surely raise them.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating first session. Can I just say to our 3 witnesses, really appreciate your time today. We have run slightly over, but we just wanted to get into as much detail as we possibly could. We will now suspend our session so we can have a swift changeover over at the panels.